In this post, I want to talk about a new study which looked at personality differences between sexes within professions. This study is interesting in its own right, and I think it, along with other research, points to a serious methodological problem in many experiments which purport to measure the effects of racist and sexist discrimination. Most people realize that men and women on average have somewhat different personalities. Many studies have shown, for instance, that women are more empathetic than men, while men are more competitive than women and think in a more systematic way. A study from Aarhus University in Denmark investigated whether or not these sex differences in personality existed even among men and women who are the same age and who share the same profession. The Danish researchers found that in most professions, sex differences in personality persisted even when looking at participants of the same age. For instance, within a given age group, female dentists were found to be much more empathetic than male dentists. This suggests that it might be a mistake to assume that groups of people are psychologically the same just because they have similar credentials. This is not the first study to imply that such an assumption may be misleading. Consider, for example, the Department of Education's National Survey of Adult Literacy. This national survey, which was given to nearly 14,000 people, tested the degree to which Americans could solve problems requiring practical competency in math, reading, and document comprehension. Because the study had such a large sample, there was enough data to compare the scores of members of different ethnic groups with similar levels of educational attainment. What the National Survey of Adult Literacy found was that huge differences in literacy existed between ethnic groups even when controlling for educational attainment. The most alarming of these differences was between blacks and whites on the mathematical literacy test. On average, black Americans who had made it into graduate school scored worse than white Americans who had been to college but hadn't even gotten an associate's degree. In fact, the black graduate students only scored marginally better than whites who had never been to college at all. Similarly, studies carried out in Britain have shown that whites score better on academic tests than blacks at every level of educational attainment. Hopefully it is clear by now that we can't just assume that all group differences disappear when we compare people with similar educational and occupational backgrounds. And yet the idea that we can make this assumption is foundational to a large body of social science research. For several decades, researchers have been carrying out experiments in which they show that people of different races, sexes, or religions are treated differently even when they are matched for things like educational attainment and work history. Such studies have shown that otherwise identical job resumes get far fewer callbacks when the applicant is black or female compared to when they are white and male. Now, at first glance, this seems like a rigorous piece of evidence for the view that unfair discrimination against minorities has a powerful impact on economic opportunities. But a necessary assumption behind such studies is that people from different races and sexes are more or less the same when you control for variables like work history and education. But as we've already seen, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that simply isn't true. And if there are significant differences between groups of people who are matched for these variables, then employers may be treating them differently because of these real and significant differences and not because of unfair prejudices. Some people reply to this argument by suggesting that discrimination experiments compare people who are so similar that the group differences found in the studies I cited above are probably not present. In other words, it is possible that group differences exist when comparing people who go to similar schools or who work in the same profession, but not when comparing people who went to the exact same school for the exact same degree and then worked at the exact same jobs. Now, the basic intuition behind this argument is right. The more similar the people are we are comparing, the smaller group differences between them will be. And so group differences among participants in discrimination experiments are probably smaller than the group differences found in studies like the National Study of Adult Literacy. But all that tells us is that the differences are smaller. It doesn't say anything about how much smaller. Assuming the group differences are reduced by 100% in discrimination experiments is no more valid than assuming that they are reduced by 50%. Without more data, we have no way of knowing the degree of reduction. And if we don't know that there are no group differences, we can't know that wrongful discrimination is what is causing the differential treatment seen in these experiments. We've seen that basic controls don't make group differences go away and that it is wrong to assume that they do. By examining the reasons why group differences exist after controlling for certain variables, I think we can go one step further. We can say that it is highly unlikely that group differences disappear even when we use highly specific controls like those seen in discrimination experiments. To understand why groups of people with the same degrees and work histories would differ, we need to understand that these sorts of qualifications tell us that people's abilities are within a certain range. For instance, if you're 40 and have an associate's degree but no higher degree, then you are probably a little smarter than the average person, but not way smarter. In other words, you are probably within the slightly above average range of intelligence. Note that this is a range and not a single value. Some people with an associate's degree from a specific school, say Washington Community College, in communications, are smarter than others. Once we understand that credentials are proxies for ranges of ability, it is easy to see why group differences don't disappear when they are controlled for. If two distributions are highly similar, but one is shifted to the right, meaning that one distribution has a higher average score than the other, then the mean values of the distributions will differ even within a given range because the distributions will be different over any significant span of values. Now that all sounds rather abstract, but it's easy to demonstrate. Consider this distribution. It shows how two imaginary populations, the oranges and the blues, scored on the test of shouting volume. You'll notice that the orange population scores higher on average than the blue population. Unfortunately, everyone on Color Island, where the orange and blue people live, is hard of hearing. Because of this, shouting is considered a very valuable skill in customer service. Some people on Color Island think that there is unfair discrimination, however, against the blues. To test this, social scientists looked at what happened when two job applicants who both had an associate's degree in screaming from the same school, but who differed in color, applied for the same jobs. They found that orange people were more likely to get hired than blue people were, and so concluded that colorism was the cause. These social scientists are assuming that the screaming abilities of blues and oranges who have the same degree from the same school will be identical. But consider this. Let's say that having an associate's degree and no higher from this school tells employers that your screening score is probably between 4 and 5 points on the Color Island yelling exam. Using the graph below, we can easily calculate the average score of oranges and blues within that range. What we find is that the orange mean value, 4.57, is still higher than the blue mean value, 4.42. Now on the one hand, that gap is only 15% the size of the gap in the general population. But on the other hand, it still exists, and could still be significant. Clearly then, in order for discrimination experiments to work, the range of people who have the qualifications that the experiments match for must be so small that the remaining gap between the groups is insignificant. In other words, people that have identical degrees and job experience all have to be basically the same people. Intuitively, this doesn't seem very likely. And as I've already shown, the data we do have doesn't back this up. Perhaps most importantly, the majority of researchers doing these experiments don't even recognize that this is a problem. Until they do, and until they rigorously address it by controlling for direct measurements of ability, discrimination experiments cannot be justifiably interpreted as measurements of the effects of prejudice. And so far I've been assuming that credentials mean the same thing for different groups. But there is evidence to suggest that this is false. It would appear that well-meaning people who have tried to give opportunities to groups that they perceive as disadvantaged have in the process lowered the standards that it takes for these minorities to achieve certain qualifications. The best data on this concerns race and college admissions, so that is what I will focus on. Work done by sociologists at Princeton found that if you compare people who did equally well in school, black Americans are over 5 times as likely as white Americans to be admitted into an American college. Similarly, data released by the Association of the American Medical Colleges in 2014 showed that Asian Americans with a GPA of 3.2 to 3.39 and MCAT scores between 24 and 26 had a 6.5% chance of being admitted into an American medical school. White Americans with those same scores had an 8% chance of admittance. By contrast, black Americans with those very same scores had a 59% chance of admittance. Now imagine if this was happening on Color Island. Using the same distribution as before, we can assume as we did before that oranges with an associate's degree from a given college have screening scores between 4 and 5. While blues, thanks to a new affirmative action policy created by the College Admissions Office, have scores between 3 and 5. The average blue score from this college falls from 4.42 to 4.16, and the gap between oranges and blues of the same degree from the same school nearly triples in size. And we know for a fact that this kind of affirmative action takes place for black people in America. It might take place for women too, and to the extent that it does, it makes it highly improbable that people of different races and sexes of the same credentials also have the same abilities. And it therefore makes it highly unlikely that the assumptions necessary for discrimination experiments to work are valid. Even if you accept that group differences exist after controlling for qualifications, it might occur to you that most people are not aware of all the statistics that I've referenced in this post. The average employer, for instance, doesn't know that black graduate students do about as well at practical math as whites who have never attended college. Since most people don't know these statistics, one might argue that they can't be the basis for their discrimination. And so even if group differences between participants in discrimination experiments do exist, most people don't know about them and so don't discriminate based off of them. The only option left is that they discriminate due to prejudice. Like the previous counter-argument, this argument is based on something that is true. Most people don't know the statistics I've referenced and so are not using them to inform how they treat people. But most people don't have to be aware of these statistics in order to know about group differences. If these group differences do exist, then many people will experience them on a day-to-day basis. For instance, it could easily be the case that people have noticed, at least on a subconscious level, that there are differences between male and female doctors, and that lived experience is what informs their behavior. So yes, most people don't know about the empirical evidence of group differences that I've covered, but that doesn't mean that they don't know that the group differences exist based on what they have personally observed. And so I do think it is plausible that true beliefs are rationally leading to the discrimination that researchers observe in their experiments. Now, I want to stress that I'm not saying that I know that racism and sexism isn't what's causing the differential treatment of minorities in these experiments. What I am saying is that groups of people compared in such experiments probably differ in ability, and so the experiments don't demonstrate that racist and sexist discrimination is a serious problem. I should also make it clear that there are obviously racist and sexist employers, and that no doubt does hold back some minorities. But demonstrating how common and how powerful such discrimination is lies beyond the methods currently being utilized by social scientists.